Good afternoon. This is Joe Papano from FiberLink Communications. I wanted to thank you for joining our webinar today. Today's webinar is on Android fragmentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what Android fragmentation means specifically, and we're going to talk about what you can do as an IT organization or as an IT professional to better manage Android devices at your company. Android fragmentation is really a direct result of Google's decision to make Android open source. That means anyone can download the source code and add some great new feature to it. So that means there's a lot of innovation going on. That also means there's a lot of variation and a lot of variants of Android out there in the world. And it's that innovation and the pace of the innovation that's really driving the growth of Android. In Q4 of 2010, Android became the leading smartphone platform worldwide, and in that quarter, a third of the 101 million smartphones sold in the world were Android devices. At this moment, there are 300,000 Android devices being enabled per hour. So in the 30 minutes we're going to spend today together, there'll be another 150,000 Android devices in the world. So let's start by getting some perspectives on the Android fragmentation problem from some different players in the Android ecosystem. So if you ask Google, this is the picture they will show you of the fragmentation in the Android ecosystem. And from their picture, about 90% of the Android devices in the world are running either 2.1 or 2.2, which are the major versions of Android that were available commercially in 2010. Android 2.3 came out at the very tail end of 2010 and is just making it into the marketplace now, which is why its adoption is still low. Of course, if you ask others, you'll get a little different picture. This is an eye chart courtesy of TweetDeck, and if this doesn't scare you, I don't think anything would. Now, what's interesting is that despite what appears to be quite a bit of fragmentation here, the folks at TweetDeck said that actually developing their Android app for the Android platform really wasn't all that much work. So I think reality is really somewhere in between. It's not quite as orderly as Google would like you to believe, and it's certainly not as chaotic as this chart would lead you to believe. So let's look at a little bit of data to try to quantify this. So let's look at a little data. There are over 125 Android devices from 30 plus manufacturers in the marketplace, and there are nearly 80 different Android phones currently for sale in the United States. In 2010, there were devices shipped running 5 separate versions of Android from 1.5 through 2.2. Android devices are available from over 15 carriers worldwide, and there is both carrier-specific pre-installed software on Android devices as well as carrier-specific filtering of applications available in the Android market. So there's no doubt that there is a great deal of variety in the Android marketplace, but I think the question really is that a problem, and if so, who is it a problem for? So let's take a quick look at that. So is this a problem for end users? I think the answer is possibly, and I think it depends on whether some app that the consumer wants to use is available on the Android device that they're carrying. For Android developers, I think the answer is probably. It is certainly more effort to develop, test, and support applications that have to run against multiple variants. However, it's a big market and it's growing faster than any other smartphone market, so the app developers really can't afford to ignore it. For corporations, I think the answer is maybe. The CEO knows that his employees are going to be more productive. The CFO knows he can save money. The employees know their teenagers can do all this stuff at home already. For the IT department, I think the answer is definitely. Right? You're the folks that are responsible for securing these devices, for managing these devices, and supporting the end users. And certainly that is more of a challenge in the Android ecosystem right now. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to ignore Android. It's here. It's growing. So I think the job for IT is to really understand what the risks are, where the gaps are, and to look for practices and tools that can help address the variations in the Android marketplace. So let's spend a minute talking about what some of those challenges are. One clear challenge is for the help desk and for your end user support processes. So help desks are almost always built around a standardization strategy, standardized platforms, tools, processes, training, documentation, and Android and its variants don't really create a help desk friendly environment at the moment. Another challenge is in reporting, and by this I mean the reporting related to inventory management. And what you will run into is that different makes and models of Android devices do not report consistent information about the device, and they don't always produce consistent data about a specific characteristic, like for example the OS version running on the device. Security is probably the major challenge for the Android ecosystem right now. There are still many core security features that are missing from the operating system. For example, hardware-based encryption is still missing from the Android platform. There are many active sync security features that are implemented inconsistently across Android devices. For example, in our own organization, we enabled a passcode policy on our Android devices via ActiveSync, and all of our non-Motorola Android devices began having problems receiving email. So that's an example of the kind of problem you can run into. And there are certainly a number of applications that open new vulnerabilities, so you may need to understand what software is installed, what vulnerabilities are present, and perform some type of application blacklisting in those cases. And the final challenge for IT is that there really is no ability to upgrade the platform across the entire Android ecosystem. So at the current time, to get an Android update requires cooperation of both the device manufacturer as well as the carrier that the device was sold through. And this is one big advantage that the iOS ecosystem of Apple's has over Android. Apple does have the ability to make iOS upgrades available to their entire ecosystem of iPhones, iPod Touches, and iPads. And I think that is one of the reasons why, for example, over 90% of iOS devices are running one of the two latest versions of iOS. So the reason we're here today is to learn how you get a handle on all this. And the good news is that there are efficient ways to safely and securely manage Android devices in a corporation. And it starts with defining an enterprise mobility management strategy. If you attended our webinar 2 weeks ago, Philippe Winthrop from the Enterprise Mobility Foundation made the same point in regard to managing personal mobile devices, which was you really must start by defining a strategy in order to be successful. The goal of enterprise mobility management is to maximize customer satisfaction and employee productivity while at the same time minimizing the cost and risk for your organization. And EMM is really best approached from an outside-in perspective versus an inside-out perspective. There's a natural tendency to focus inside out and begin by looking at the device, which is classic mobile device management. But I think if you start at the device, it certainly can cause you to miss important things that are required in order to make sure that your enterprise mobility management strategy is going to be effective for you and complete. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about the key issues and decisions that you need to make at each level, starting at the outermost ring, the user ring, and working our way towards the inside, towards the device. And I'll highlight how you can use this model to help you better manage fragmentation among the Android devices in your organization. At the user level, you're really going to be concerned with defining policies. So you're going to be deciding who should be mobilized, how they're going to be mobilized, and what they're going to be mobilized with. At the application level, you're defining what applications you plan to deploy or allow, and more importantly, deciding what applications you may need to restrict. At the data level, you're deciding how you plan to protect the data that's consumed and produced by the mobile applications at the layer above. And in the case of a personal device, you have the added issue of how to manage the personal data that may be on the device while simultaneously protecting the corporate data that resides on the device. At the network level, you're determining what public and private networks your mobile devices will use, and in the case of public networks, how the use of those networks will be paid for. And finally, at the device level, you're concerned with how to physically manage the device. How will you track it? How will you manage and administer it? So I've given you a brief introduction of the issues at each of the 5 layers of a classic model for enterprise mobility management. And now we'll talk a little bit more detail about each level. For users, you must define sensible terms of use and acceptable use policies, and of course you have to have your employees agree to them. For example, with terms of use, if employees are going to use personal devices, they may need to accept in the terms of use that if they lose the device or they leave the company, the corporation has the right to wipe the device and that any personal data stored on the device may be erased at the same time. Another decision is to determine which employees or roles require a corporate device and whether employees that don't qualify for a corporate device can use personal devices. If you plan to allow personal devices or you allow employees to choose the corporate device that they'll carry from a list, it is certainly a good practice to publish an approved list or a recommended list, and that may also include the carriers that you would prefer to work with. This can really simplify some of the issues you need to deal with in regard to Android fragmentation, because you can certainly channel your users to adopt devices that you're familiar with or you know have specific capabilities that will make it simpler for you to manage and secure the device. And last but not least, you will need to define what type of end user support you're going to provide. Many companies will vary the support they offer based on some type of segmentation of users. What I've seen that I think works fairly well for this is a simple 3-level hierarchy that I've labeled corporate, trusted, and untrusted. And at the corporate level, this implies that the employee is carrying a corporate-owned device and the corporation has a full ability to secure, manage, and support the device as well as the user. The trusted category implies an employee who's carrying a device that they own themselves, but it meets some basic threshold that the organization has defined, and therefore it's sanctioned for approved uses, like, for example, email. And then finally, the untrusted category implies that the corporation can't manage, secure, or support the device, and so it's going to land in a quarantine type of state until possibly it's either known, in which case it might be sanctioned for certain uses, or it might be prevented from any use at all of corporate resources. When deciding on applications, it's really about determining which applications different segments of your user population are permitted to use, and of course what applications they may not be permitted to use. And I do think it helps to use a framework, as we did with users, corporate, trusted, untrusted type of framework, to help make the decisions about which applications different user groups are permitted to use and which applications they aren't permitted to use. And there are really 4 basic application types that you need to evaluate. The first being your collaboration applications, email, contacts, calendar. Access to corporate email and calendar and web browsing are really the killer apps for smartphone users. These are the apps you want to make sure you can support safely across the broadest range of devices. The quickest way to allow your mobile users to access their corporate email through a mobile device is by enabling Exchange Active Sync or Outlook web access. If you have Exchange deployed in the Lotus Notes environment, there's a product called Notes Traveler that is the Notes implementation of the ActiveSync protocol. There are 2 things to pay attention to with enabling ActiveSync that are important. The first is from a security perspective. You need to make sure that your attachments are protected. So ActiveSync will allow attachments to be downloaded to the mobile device. You can disable that if you want, but if you're going to allow it, then you need to make sure that you have a way to ensure that attachments get protected. The other thing to keep in mind as it relates to Exchange ActiveSync with Android devices is that each Android device will have a different implementation of ActiveSync on the device side talking to your Exchange servers, and you will find variations in policy support across the devices, and you will find variations in which ActiveSync actions are implemented across your mobile devices. If you plan to deploy enterprise applications, you'll certainly need to make sure that the apps you plan to deploy are supported on the various platforms, and in the case of Android that may mean testing to ensure that it works as expected. Many companies develop custom line of business applications for their mobile devices, And if you have these or you plan these, then you'll certainly need to do compatibility testing in the case of Android, and you will also probably be looking for some type of a enterprise app store capability in your mobile device management infrastructure. So that would be something much like the Android market, but a private version of it that would be for the use of your corporation to distribute and manage your custom mobile applications. The final application area you will need to evaluate is whether apps, commercial apps available through the Android market are allowed or not, and you certainly may need to blacklist apps that are available commercially through the market. The data issues you need to be concerned with are tightly bound to the applications that your mobile users are taking advantage of. As we mentioned earlier, email would clearly be the key application that you would want to mobilize or enable. And what you need to pay attention to with email are attachments and what happens to the attachments. The key decision you need to make is whether you will allow attachments to be saved to the mobile device. And if you are going to allow that, you then need to make sure that you have a way to encrypt that data. And you also need to make sure that you have a way to remove that data from the device if it is lost or stolen. The Android platform today does really not offer encryption features or remote wipe features that you could count on across the entire Android ecosystem. So you will need to look at third-party MDM solutions here to ensure that you can enforce data encryption or remote wipe of data across the broadest range of your devices. Mobile versions of enterprise applications that you are deploying would have a lot of the same vulnerabilities as email, so there could be data that's stored locally on the mobile device, and you need to make sure that data can be encrypted, and you need to make sure that you can wipe that data if the device is lost or stolen. Another area of data protection you need to pay attention to is to determine whether users have deployed commercial data storage and sync applications on their mobile devices. This would be things like Dropbox that allow users to very simply synchronize data from their mobile device up to the cloud, up to third-party storage. And it's hard to know whether users are using these or not. You would probably need to do a software inventory on your mobile devices to determine that. And if you believe that's a problem for you, you would need an ability to blacklist those types of applications. And again, you would be looking at a third-party MDM solution for this type of capability, especially in the Android ecosystem. Removable storage in a smartphone is another data security risk that you need to consider. When a phone is tethered to a PC, for example, it can obviously be used just like any other type of USB storage device. And many smartphones have a micro SD or some other type of capability to add storage to the device, and data can find its way onto those. The capabilities you're looking for here are the ability to encrypt data if it rests on removable storage, and obviously the ability to wipe data off the removable storage if it's in the device. One last thing about data protection. The most likely threat to your data occurs when a mobile device is lost or stolen. And the capability you need to be able to have to deal with that or address that is called remote wipe. So that's the ability to send a signal to a mobile device that causes it to reset itself, and in the process removes any data that may have been residing on the device. You need to make sure that you understand what type of capabilities you have, especially in the Android ecosystem. Even with something that's a standard like Exchange ActiveSync, you may find that certain makes and models of Android devices do not support remote wipe with Exchange ActiveSync. You will need to define policies around the use of corporate networks, the corporate wireless LAN, and the corporate VPN. Depending on your ability to secure and manage a device, you may need to prevent it from accessing these private networks. And at a minimum, if you want to enable secure access to these types of networks, you will need some type of third-party MDM solution that can push the appropriate WLAN and VPN profiles to the mobile devices. That is not something that is supported by Exchange ActiveSync. Your company will also need to define policies around the use and cost for using public networks. This is primarily an expense management exercise, and what you will need to think through is How will the wireless plans that are associated with your smartphones be paid for? Will the company provision and pay for the service? Will the employee provision it and the company reimburse them? Or will there be no reimbursement at all? And of course, if the company is going to be reimbursing the employee, they will also have the issue of how they charge that back to the appropriate business units. So it really is a classic telecom expense management type of activity. And now, last but not least, let's talk a little bit about managing the Android devices themselves. At the moment, there's certainly a debate in the mobility community about whether Android is ready for the enterprise or not. You'll find people on both sides of that. My position is a bit pragmatic. Since Android is now the most popular smartphone operating system by sales, I think that as a corporation you have to make sure that you understand how you're going to support it. I don't think you can just ignore it. However, there are some important things to know about different security features in the various versions of Android. And one piece of advice I would give you is that prior to Android 2.2, there's just not enough security and management features in the operating system to really use it in any kind of trusted way in an enterprise. Let me highlight a couple of the major security features that are in Android 2.2. First one is there is a Device Policy Manager API in Android 2.2, so that allows third-party mobile device management solutions like MAS 360 to manage the device and enforce security policies on the device, things like minimum password strength and data wipe. So features like that via third-party platforms really aren't supported prior to 2.2. There were also a few ActiveSync feature enhancements made in Android 2.2 that are important. The most important is remote wipe support was added via ActiveSync in Android 2.2. We discussed how important that capability is when you're trying to protect data. Prior to 2.2, you could not remotely wipe an Android device through ActiveSync. The other major security enhancement that was made was allowing enforcement of an alphanumeric PIN or password via ActiveSync. So that's another ActiveSync security feature that you could not enforce or perform prior to Android 2.2. Unfortunately, the newest versions of Android, 2.3, which was just released, and 2.4, which is on the way, really are focused much more on usability enhancements, and there's not much for IT in either of those releases. So you will need to segment your Android users and what they're allowed to do based on the Android version running on their smartphone. If you're planning to manage these devices through Exchange ActiveSync, it may also be necessary to segment them based on the manufacturer and the model. And the reason for that is that the implementation of ActiveSync on devices can vary significantly. So there are specific features and functions that you may be able to perform on some manufacturers' devices via ActiveSync that you couldn't perform on others, and you will need to understand what those differences are. The final aspect of device management that you will need to consider is the architecture of the mobile device management technology that you plan to deploy or use in order to manage and secure these devices. So as of today, there's really three paths you could go down. The most common path is to use Exchange ActiveSync, which has been in the market for a number of years now, to manage your mobile devices. It's certainly the most common and easiest way to get started, but there are certainly a number of significant security gaps, I'll call them, with Exchange ActiveSync that you should be aware of, and we'll talk about those in a minute. To address some of these gaps in Exchange ActiveSync, there are a number of vendors that have third-party mobile device management solutions. These solutions often involve two components: an agent-side piece of software that resides on the mobile device and a server-side component where inventory management and administration occur. FiberLink's mobile device management solution is called MAS 360 for mobile devices. What separates us from most of the other folks in the MDM space is that MAS 360's server-side components live in the cloud. So it's a cloud-based management console, and it doesn't require any hardware or setup in your own internal network in order to perform mobile device management. And getting the agent software out to the endpoints is a fairly simple registration process that the smartphone users can go through themselves to get started. And you will see companies that take a hybrid approach to mobile device management where they use a third-party MDM product for securing some devices and they use Exchange ActiveSync for others. I did want to discuss for a few moments the advantages of an agent-based MDM solution, and these are certainly targeted at filling or addressing some of the gaps in Exchange ActiveSync. These third-party MDM solutions are really much more than wrappers around Exchange ActiveSync, and I think it's important that you understand what some of those advantages are. The key one is that there are a number of additional security features that can be provided by third-party MDM implementations. Selective wipe, for example, is something that you cannot do at all via Exchange ActiveSync, which many third-party MDM solutions implement, as well as encryption. Another important advantage of MDM solutions is that they ensure that there's a consistent set of security policies that exist and can be managed across all your mobile devices. For example, you may have a policy that passcodes need to be a certain length, 8 characters long. And with a third-party MDM solution, you can be certain that you can effectively enforce that policy across all of your mobile devices. With Exchange ActiveSync, that really depends on the implementation on the agent side and whether it supports enforcing a passcode length policy. Another advantage of MDM solutions over EAS is that you will get a richer set of data about your devices and a more consistent set of data about your devices, and I'll give you a couple of quick examples. With Exchange ActiveSync, you really don't get any information at all about the wireless network that the device is using, so the home carrier or whether the device is roaming or not, and you get no location information. You will also find, especially with Android, that you will get inconsistent data reported back from different devices for the exact same data field. A really good example of this is the operating system reported back by the device. Some Android devices will report back their operating system as Android. Some will report back Android with the version number appended to it. Obviously, if you're segmenting what users can do or what policy set they're in based on the Android version number, it would be very important to know what version it is, and you can't always count on that with ActiveSync. Another overlooked issue that is addressed by MDM solutions is the gap in the policy management model of Exchange ActiveSync. In Exchange ActiveSync, you associate policies with the mailbox that's being managed in Exchange. You do not assign policies to a device. And so what that means is essentially you can only have one policy associated with a mailbox, even though that mailbox may be getting accessed from multiple mobile devices. And in some cases, those mobile devices may be running different platforms. So maybe someone's carrying an Android smartphone and an iPad, and they want to be able to access their corporate email through either device. This is problematic in Exchange since it's doubtful that the same policies would be enforced in an equal way on Android devices and iOS devices. So those are a few of the key gaps in Exchange ActiveSync that are solved or addressed by third-party MDM solutions like MAS360. Before we wrap up, I wanted to make sure you were aware of a couple of significant announcements for the Android ecosystem that came out of the Mobile World Congress this week. The first significant announcement was Google announcing full device encryption in Android 3.0. Now the one caveat here is that 3.0 is meant for tablet devices only, but I'm certain that that functionality, that encryption functionality, will make its way to the smartphone devices in the future. At the Mobile World Congress, both Samsung and Motorola announced that they will be developing APIs for securing and managing Android devices that they will be pre-installing on their devices. And I think the Motorola announcement's a little bit more significant because they've also announced that a number of other smartphone manufacturers, HTC, Sony Ericsson, Sharp, and others, have already announced that they will also pre-install that same set of APIs. So that's very promising because that means that there could be a common security and management layer that's running on Android devices from a number of leading manufacturers. I want to leave you with 3 key takeaways related to Android and its adoption in the enterprise. And I think the most important one is that you really can't avoid Android anymore, and I don't think it's going to be as simple as legislating it away, meaning that companies will make decisions that they're not going to support it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is certainly that the trend is moving away from corporate provisioning of mobile devices. So more and more of the devices that are showing up in enterprises are owned by the employees, and so they're making their own decisions about what devices they want to buy, and more frequently they're deciding to buy Android devices. And the other relevant trend here is that your employees are expecting to be able to use mobile devices as part of getting their job done. So they're already quite familiar with how mobile devices make their personal lives easier and simpler, and they expect that same ease of use and simplicity in their professional life. Although the current fragmentation in the Android ecosystem does create some challenges for IT, I do believe that there are practices and tools available that can help you to better manage that, and specifically focusing on an enterprise mobility management strategy and the components of that, which we discussed earlier. And then, of course, adopting tools, whether it's Exchange ActiveSync or Exchange ActiveSync with third-party MDM solutions, to help you better manage and secure your mobile devices. And finally, I do believe that there's help on the way. So we started this webinar by talking about how the pace of innovation in the Android ecosystem is one of the things that's fueling its adoption. And a moment ago we spoke about these announcements from Google, Motorola, and Samsung related to management and security. And so I think all of those things are very good news for IT in particular, that gaps in securing and managing Androids are being recognized and that vendors are actively innovating to address those issues. A couple of quick announcements and then we'll break. Our next webinar will be March 3rd. Donna Lima will be providing a webinar on provisioning and MDM for iPhones, iPads, and Androids, so please join us for that if you can. You can access recordings of all of our webinars at the Master Center, and you see the link there, including the last two webinars which Philippe Winthrop from the Enterprise Mobility Foundation hosted. So please visit the Master Center to look at our past webinars. You'll also find a lot of other great information about mobile devices and mobile device management best practices. So if you get a few minutes, please check out the Master Center. I wanted to thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.